When talking about inequality, it's very common in American discourse to conflate income and wealth, to not recognize any distinction between the two, but also to not recognize other forms of inequality. By my count, there are at least 9 different forms of inequality: wealth, income, power, prestige, social capital, security, geography, quality of work, and quality of life. Put it all together as an acronym and you get WIPSKK. Perhaps there are forms of inequality I'm missing, but I think this covers the major bases. Also, of course, there's significant overlap and interdependence between these forms. Wealth and income especially tend to correlate. People with high incomes tend to have high wealth and vice versa. As I go over each of these forms, however, you'll see that the distinctions are important. So firstly, wealth. Wealth is measured in, of course, money, but also real estate and other assets. And within the United States, not only is the distribution of wealth starkly unequal, the inequality has increased precipitously in the last several decades. The good news is that wealth has gone up not just at the top, but across most of the spectrum by most measures. You can see in the upper right chart here that the 50th percentile household wealth has gone from $41,000 in 1963 to $83,000 in 1983 and to $97,000 in 2016, all figures inflation adjusted to 2016 dollars. But what does this mean? What does wealth mean for human welfare? Well, concretely, wealth is first a measure of possessing things. More wealth equals owning more and better stuff. Wealth is also, of course, money, and money is effectively a claim on the possessions and future labor of others. But wealth is not just a matter of personal consumption. With sufficient concentration, wealth becomes capital. It becomes wealth which generates more wealth. Less tangibly, wealth provides economic security. For people with moderate wealth, their wealth gives them a fallback position in case they ever suffer long-term unemployment or underemployment. But for the sufficiently rich, wealth itself generates income, protecting them from any possibility of real hardship. So if wealth at the 50th percentile has doubled, what does that really mean? Well, for most people in the middle, what wealth they have is mostly in their house rather than saving accounts. But home ownership rates have not increased in 50 years. Instead, what's happened is that home values have gone up. Partly this reflects larger, nicer homes, but it also reflects restrictive land policies that protects incumbent homeowners and their wealth at the expense of non-owners. So even though monetarily wealth has doubled for people in the middle, it's not clear what real improvements this reflects in their lives. Yes, housing is nicer, cars are nicer, healthcare is better, education is better, but all of these things are also far more expensive, incommensurate with their increases in quality. Yes, a decent chunk of Americans are wealthier than they were 50 years ago, but most Americans today have less, not more, economic security. And because wealth has accrued so dramatically at the top, most Americans also have less power, both economic and political. The picture for income inequality is also mixed, but in different ways. Income gains at the top are not as starkly out of line as wealth gains at the top, but incomes for the average worker have totally stagnated since the early 70s. This too, though, has an asterisk. Average household income has increased significantly in the last 50 years, due mainly to the rise of two-earner households. We also should distinguish between wages and total compensation. Employer-provided health plan costs have gone up with a huge rise in medical spending, so it's not fully accurate to say that workers haven't benefited from increased productivity, assuming that is that the extra medical spending has translated into better health care. Even total compensation, however, has significantly fallen pace behind productivity gains since the early 70s, so capital has clearly somehow gained greater leverage over labor in this period. The economy is definitely producing more and better things, but a big chunk of this increased productivity is accruing as wealth at the top. Aside from income and wealth, though of course they're related, we also have a great degree of power inequality. Even within our nominal democracy, most people's daily lives are subordinated to the will of others. Your boss can't kill you or imprison you, but they generally have great latitude in every other respect, and this power is only really checked by the option to sell your labor elsewhere. Only a minority of workers, though, have sufficient pull to put restraints on their boss's demands. In some cases, these demands are expressed as quotas with objective measures. Often, though, the demands are simply to make the boss happy, to obey every order and even anticipate their desires. Your will as an employee is subsumed to the will of your employer. Though limits to the boss's power were established in the past in both law and norms, those limits have been incrementally rolled back since the 1970s. For blue-collar and white-collar workers alike, the 40-hour workweek is increasingly meaningless, and the boss's power increasingly reaches into workers' time off the clock. The lowly service worker is put on call with no guaranteed hours, and the office worker is expected to answer emails at home while also being disciplined in their personal lives because they must represent the company 24/7. Many people excuse these developments as just inevitabilities of an increasingly competitive world for which we have no alternative. Prestige is less tangible than power, but it has a major effect on human happiness. Being recognized as talented, an expert, an authority, as exceptional in some positive way, gives a person a sense of purpose, belonging, and security. To be accredited by elite educational institutions, to be validated in business by success in the market, or to be celebrated as an artist or personality, these all have intrinsic value as well as concrete material benefits. An important question then is whether prestige, like power, is a rivalrous good. If everyone has it, then does no one have it? While everyone in a small group could be recognized for their unique value, it's hard to imagine this scaling to all of society. And what of people who simply aren't exceptional in any way? Can these people have purpose, belonging, and security without any prestige? Social capital is quite similar to prestige, but it's prestige translated into material benefit. Your education credentials, your work history, your personal brand, your business ties, your social network, all of these things are the building blocks of a career. Without social capital, your career probably doesn't even start. As society has grown more competitive through globalization and media saturation, social capital has become even more valuable. In a world of global competition and fractured attention, anything which stands out commands an even higher premium, and everything else gets relatively devalued. We should also note that the value of social capital isn't purely economic. Your social capital greatly determines your social standing as well. Like making money requires already having money, making social connections similarly requires already having social connections. Physical security is a facet of inequality. Some people face daily threats more so than others, but I'm primarily thinking of economic security here. Baseline economic security is an assurance that you'll have your basic needs met, and for people higher in the ladder, security is also an assurance that they won't lose what they have and fall down the ladder. Even people whose probability of falling down the ladder is objectively low, these people still often feel threatened because the consequences of falling seem very dire. In a world of many crises, with a political system seemingly incapable of improving anything, Americans in particular have learned that the only security they can really have is in their personal wealth. Public provision, to what extent it lingers on from earlier eras, seems fragile or even doomed in the face of the next inevitable crises. Maybe it will be the national debt, or global depression, or climate change, or peak oil, or terrorism, or another disappointing war, but Americans can feel that some coming stressor will break any remains of shared prosperity. In the last 2 decades, we've already seen that, whatever the crisis, the private property of the wealthy is held sacrosanct, so it seems the only truly safe place to be is as close to the top as possible. Who gets to live where? Obviously, the wealthy have always had nicer housing, but major cities and regions of the US in the last few decades have pushed out most of their poor and even much of their middle class. In the same period, job growth in the US, particularly for the most desirable jobs, has been very concentrated in its most expensive cities. Of course, the best jobs wouldn't go to the low-skilled tiers of the workforce either way, but this situation puts everyone not at the very top in precarity. Career advancement at all tiers of the workforce is increasingly tied to accepting housing and living costs that eat away any increase in wages. So the inequality of geography isn't just about housing, it's about access to jobs. Many younger adults in particular are trapped. They have no real prospects in the small towns, nor increasingly the suburbs, but the jobs available to them in cities don't pay enough to live there. On top of all this, provision of public services is largely rationed in the United States through zoning. Public education in particular is financed mostly by local property taxes, so Americans effectively pay into the better schools by buying an expensive house. A lot of work, probably most work, has no intrinsic value to those who perform it. Digging ditches and folding laundry are useful for their outcomes, but the undertakings themselves provide no pleasure or salutary effects. We can call this shit work. Some work, however, can induce satisfaction in those who perform it. Making art, building things, developing ideas, helping others through direct social interaction, like teaching and therapy. We can call this hobby work, because it fairly resembles things which people do voluntarily in their own time. In practice, most jobs are pure shit work. Very few are pure hobby work, but a decent number contain a mix of both. So an overlooked component of inequality is the distribution of shit work and hobby work. Even if we leveled wages and benefits, the question would remain of who gets the cool jobs. Aside from the value of the work itself, there's of course also a great disparity of working conditions. Some workplaces are noisier, smellier, dirtier, hotter, colder, and more dangerous than others, and some work is physically or mentally taxing with long-term health costs. Some workers have great autonomy over their work, others are regimented down to the minute. So again, even if we equalize wages and benefits, there's still a question of ameliorating work conditions and distributing the work itself, both the good work and the bad work. Lastly, there's great inequality in our lives outside of work. Good food, exercise, entertainment, socializing, travel, all of these things of course require both time and money. Less obviously, the time monopolization and pressures of work increasingly cut across the income and wealth spectrum. Many of those towards the top underconsume these things for want of time rather than money. Travel in particular is something Americans underconsume due to work commitments. Even for high-end workers who do consume many luxuries, their general quality of life is often undermined by the stresses of their careers. Compared to the poor, sure, it's better to weather stress under the comforts of wealth, but I think it's important to note that the problems of a hyper-competitive society are more universal than often supposed. So no, we don't live in an equal society, but what does this all mean? Isn't inequality the necessary cost of producing the material things without which our lives would be much worse? This is a common line of argument, that the technological and productivity gains of recent decades justify increasing inequality. It is said that perhaps those at the top are benefiting most, but everyone is benefiting too. 50 years ago, no one had a smartphone, a powerful laptop computer, the internet, or a big flat-screen TV. But now in the United States and most of the industrialized world, most everyone does. Today's cars are better, the household appliances are better, the food is better, the medicine is better. Many things are better in big and also subtle ways. So even accepting this frame, do the benefits of inequality outweigh the costs? Well, perhaps so if inequality were just a matter of income and wealth. But as I just laid out, inequality has many forms. If you look just at the typical American's consumption, things seem to have greatly improved in the last 50 years, but we should also factor in the less tangible forms of inequality. The benefits of consumption should be weighed against worsening working conditions, work hours, career prospects, and geographic mobility, and also feelings of powerlessness, status anxiety, and insecurity. Yes, the TVs and phones have improved, but other key facets of life have gotten worse for most Americans. It's also important to note that those towards the top are not immune from these deleterious effects of inequality. Though the wealthy face no real threat of destitution, the prospect of falling down just a rung or two can feel like a kind of death. To lose their position isn't just a threat to their standard of living, it's a threat to their work life, their life ambitions, their social standing, and even their own self-conception. With lesser wealth, they would no longer really be the same person. The people in this trap tend also to be the professional managerial meritocrats who most fully embrace neoliberal ideology. So to the extent they recognize these problems, their only considered solution is to make a more perfect meritocracy. The problem is not the premise of the game, they say. The game just needs to be made more fair. Now, I don't actually think it's necessary nor prudent to abolish meritocracy entirely, but consider that there are two components of meritocracy, a sorting function and a reward function. The sorting function chooses the winners and losers. The reward function apportions rewards and punishments. The neoliberal critique of meritocracy is that the sorting function is imperfect and in need of tuning. But the radical critique of meritocracy is that the reward function shouldn't bestow such a great disparity of outcomes between the people at the top and the people at the bottom. Top performers don't actually need incentives orders of magnitude out of line with the median reward, and bottom performers don't actually need the threat of destitution for society to extract a reasonable amount of labor from them. This is an obvious critique, but it's heretical in American discourse to suggest that we should have less competition rather than more. So finally, if inequality is more than just income and wealth, is full equality even possible? In some respects, it's obvious enough what equality would mean. Distribution of income and wealth can be leveled, or short of that greatly compressed. The state and workplace can be made more democratic. Competition can be ramped down, thereby lessening general anxieties. And everyone can be guaranteed basic necessities and a share of the luxuries we produce. But in a few respects, it's much less obvious what equality would mean. First, in an equal society, can no one hold prestige? Is no one celebrated for being exceptional? It actually seems really hard to imagine a modern society without, say, famous athletes, actors, musicians, etc. Absent other inequalities, is this sort of inequality harmless enough? Second, if everyone is granted full geographic mobility, Does the entire society then live in the same handful of cities? Even if all housing were of equal quality, it's hard to imagine all locations being equally valued. So the most desirable housing would still have to be rationed in some way. And third, unless we revert to a pre-industrial economy, which I don't think would be desirable nor even really possible, we'll still rely upon the division of specialized labor. Even were everyone equally capable, not everyone could develop the same expert skills, and not all workers could commute to the same work locations. With these skill matching and location matching problems, it's not obvious how good and bad work could be distributed fully equally, or even nearly equally. If we're going to do anything serious about inequality, this last conundrum, the distribution of work, is particularly critical to solve. Though our discourse on jobs tends to focus on money, Americans carry a lot of anxiety about work itself, and it's rare that our politics addresses these anxieties. When most Americans imagine a potential socialist future, they think of themselves stuck in basically the same work, but just taxed more. So I think it's clear socialists need to speak about broader economic anxieties than just money. Fixing inequality is more than about just money, and so it's going to require Americans to imagine a different life.